At the beginning, sisters, I want to give you a very brief summary of the 12 characteristics that I mentioned the last time about the Gospel of Luke. And the first thing that we said was that Luke's is the only Gospel to record the announcements of the births of both John the Baptist and Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, there is the announcement to Joseph of the birth of Jesus in a dream sequence. However, in the Gospel of Luke, there is the announcement of the birth of John to his father Zechariah when he is in the temple, which is where the Gospel of Luke begins. And the announcement of the birth of Jesus is made to his mother. So already by this pairing of the male and female, Luke is showing us that he will give as much importance to women in his gospel as he gives to men. Luke's gospel begins in the temple. As a matter of fact, after situating his gospel historically, Luke will tell us that Zechariah was in the temple when the announcement was being made. The Gospel of Luke also ends in the temple when the disciples are in the temple praising and glorifying God. So in Luke, the temple is not a place that Jesus would want destroyed. The temple is a place in which Jesus continues to teach and the disciples continue to glorify God. That is why in Luke, the temple is a very, very important logos, a very, very important place. And that's why the third temptation in Luke, unlike in the Gospel of Matthew, is where Jesus is taken to the pinnacle of the temple and is there invited by the devil to throw himself down. Just as Luke narrates the announcements of the birth of John and Jesus, he narrates the births of John the Baptist and Jesus. And as a matter of fact, the narration of the birth of Jesus is done very elaborately. In Matthew's Gospel, even though Joseph is told about the birth of Jesus, we are not told how exactly Jesus was born. Luke gives a detailed story of the birth of Jesus and also narrates, even though briefly, the birth of John the Baptist. Luke's is the only Gospel of all the four which is addressed to an individual, Theophilus. Theophilus is translated as beloved of God, but Theophilus seemed to be a very influential or important Gentile figure because Luke addresses him in a very respectful tone. Because it is more Gentile oriented, Luke does not quote the Old Testament as often as the other evangelists do. Also, in keeping with his focus on the Greeks or the Gentiles, Luke will give Greek equivalents for Hebrew names. So Simon the Cananean in Hebrew becomes Simon the Zealot. Golgotha, that is the place where Jesus was crucified in Hebrew, becomes Kranion in the Gospel of Luke. Luke also, therefore, does not use the Hebrew title rabbi, but he uses didaskalos. Both mean teacher, but didaskalos is Luke's preferred title. If in the Gospel of Matthew, the genealogy begins with Abraham and comes right down to Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, the genealogy begins with Jesus and ends not with Abraham, but ends with Adam. And Luke has got 77 generations, which is 11 generations of 7 each until Jesus. And Luke wants to show that Jesus begins the 12th generation, and so Jesus is the new Adam. Luke's gospel is known as the gospel of prayer. Luke shows Jesus praying more times than any other evangelist. In the gospel of Mark, Jesus is shown praying only 3 times, and also those 3 times by Matthew and 1 or 2 more times. But in Luke, Jesus prays very often, and especially at the important moments in his life, namely his baptism, the choice of the 12, the transfiguration in Gethsemane, and even on the cross. And that is why Luke's gospel is known as the gospel of prayer. The 3 hymns of praise, beginning with the Benedictus of in the temple by the father of John the Baptist, and moving on to the Magnificat of Mary, and finally to the Nunc Dimittis of Simeon when Jesus is presented in the temple. These 3 hymns of praise are found only in the Gospel of Luke. Luke's Gospel is known as the Gospel of women. Many incidents in the Gospel of Luke, for example, the raising of the widow's son at 9, the lost coin, the woman bent for 18 years, these are found only in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus addressing the women of Jerusalem even as he is on his way to the cross, and Jesus talking about having women disciples in Luke chapter 8 verses 1 to 3 are found only in the Gospel of Luke. It is remarkable that the Lucan Jesus would have women disciples at a time when women were relegated not only to 2nd or 3rd place, but were relegated totally to the background. To imagine that Luke's Jesus would have women disciples is really extraordinary. And if this were not true, then Luke would not have stated it, because it could have been scandalous if it were not true, and Luke would have wanted to avoid scandal. The final point we saw is that Luke has many parables, and many popular and famous parables. For example, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Prodigal Father, the parable of the rich fool, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. These are found exclusively in the Gospel of Luke. Now, like the Gospel of Mark, whom Luke follows quite a bit, the Gospel of Luke also may be seen in summary form to have a similar structure to that of the Gospel of Mark. Luke's Gospel, however, being addressed to an individual, begins with a prologue in the first 4 verses, in which Luke situates his gospel historically and situates the person of Jesus historically. So in the first verses, Luke will give us a lot of history about those officials, the different kinds of officials, both Roman officials and Jewish officials, who were present before Jesus could be born and within the ministry of Jesus. This is what is found in Luke's prologue. This is followed by the infancy narrative, and because Mark does not have an infancy narrative, and because Luke's infancy narrative is quite different from that of Matthew, these verses are quite different and unique mostly to the Gospel of Luke. Jesus prepares for his ministry. Here, there are some parts which are similar to the Gospel of Mark, and there is a semblance, a relationship with the Gospel of Matthew, especially with regard to the scene of the temptation, which ends the preparation for ministry. The ministry in Galilee is very similar to that mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Galilee section begins in chapter 1, verse 14, and ends in chapter 8, verse 26. Luke's ministry in Galilee begins in chapter 4, verse 14, where Jesus comes to the synagogue in Nazareth and begins to read his manifesto, and continues until chapter 9, verse 50. In this part, Luke follows Mark very, very closely. The journey narrative, sometimes referred to as the travel narrative, is that part in the Gospel of Luke. You can see totally 10 chapters in which Luke goes quite his own way. A number of the miracles, namely the Good Samaritan, the Prodigal Father, the lost coin, are all found in this context. Even the scene of Dives and Lazarus, the parable of Dives and Lazarus, and Jesus going to the house of Martha and Mary, the parable of the rich fool who wants to build big barns, all of these are found within the journey narrative. And it is in this part that a lot of Luke's special material is found. Obviously, there is material also from Mark within this section. However, a lot of this section contains material which is very specific and exclusive to the Gospel of Luke. Because Jesus will not stop ministering, and because the relationship of Jesus with the temple remains a very cordial relationship, Jesus will continue to minister even in Jerusalem. And this is the penultimate part of Luke's Gospel. The final part of Luke's Gospel is the Passion and the Resurrection narratives. So in a summary form, what does the infancy narrative of Luke contain? It begins after the prologue by telling us about the annunciation of the birth of John. And this annunciation is made to Zechariah when he is serving in the temple. This is followed immediately by the annunciation of the birth of Jesus, and the annunciation of the birth of Jesus is made to the woman, that is the mother of Jesus, Mary, in Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 38. Mary receives the news of the annunciation from angel Gabriel and rushes to share the good news with her cousin Elizabeth. If there is one word which summarizes the reason for the visitation of Mary to Elizabeth, it is the word sharing the good news. Mary is so filled with this good news. Mary is so taken up with this good news. Mary wants to share this good news because it finds it is too much to bear for one person, and that is why she rushes to Elizabeth to share the good news with her. It is within the context of the visitation also that Mary sings this Magnificat, her hymn of praise, modeled on the hymn of praise of Hannah, the mother of Samuel. After the visitation, very briefly, in just 2 verses, Luke narrates the birth of John the Baptist and also narrates the presentation or the circumcision of John, in which he gives his father Zechariah an opportunity to sing the Benedictus. The birth of Jesus is narrated quite elaborately in chapter 2, verses 1 to 20. And this is an important point because in chapter 1, verses 26 to 38, when the Annunciation was made to Mary, like in Matthew's Gospel to Joseph, both Joseph and Mary had no choice in naming the child. The angel Gabriel in the Gospel of Luke tells Mary you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus. In other words, it is the angel, the representative, the messenger of God, and so therefore God, who gives the name Jesus. When Jesus is being presented in the temple after his birth, then the name given is Jesus, and Luke will remind us once again that the name Jesus given is the name which the angel had given him. So he will tell us that it is not the mother or the foster father who will choose the name of the child, but it is given to the mother and the foster father by God himself through the angel. This scene of the finding in the temple is found only in the Gospel of Luke. And one important reason why Luke has this scene exclusively in his Gospel is, first, the temple is an important place as far as Luke is concerned. The temple is a theological topos or a theological place, and a lot happens in the temple here. In this scene, Mary and Joseph realize who Jesus is, and Jesus realizes what he must be. So it is not so much Jesus who was lost in the temple. As a matter of fact, Jesus tells his mother that she ought to have known where he was, which is his father's business. And this father's business is what he will prepare for in this preparation for the ministry. So you might say, the third part, that is after the infancy narrative of the Gospel of Luke, is the preparation for the ministry of Jesus. And what do we have in the preparation for the ministry? It begins with John the Baptist coming onto the scene, and John the Baptist preaching in order to prepare the way of the Lord. Because John is important, but because Jesus is infinitely more important than John, what Luke will do very strategically is that he will have the imprisonment of John before the baptism of Jesus. He will have the imprisonment of John before the baptism of Jesus. So very clearly, if John is imprisoned before Jesus is baptized, it could not be John who baptized Jesus. And yet, Luke, like Matthew and Mark, retain this scene of the baptism of Jesus. If you were to ask the evangelists, Matthew and Luke, whether they would have preferred to retain the scene of the baptism, they would have said no, they would not. Why would they not want to retain the scene of the baptism? Because in the baptism of Jesus by John, Jesus seems to be shown as inferior. It is John the Baptist who baptizes Jesus, not Jesus who baptizes John. And obviously, the one who baptizes is superior to the one who is baptized. And so if Jesus is baptized by John, there is an indication that Jesus is inferior to John. And so, while Mark will have no problems about this inferiority and superiority, because Mark uses a different strategy in his gospel, what Matthew will do is, in Matthew chapter 3 verse 13, as soon as Jesus comes to John for baptism, John objects that he cannot, he's not worthy. It is Jesus who should baptize him, and it is only after Jesus gives John permission in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus tells John, let it be so, for this is the way to fulfill righteousness. It is then that John consents. It is then that John baptizes Jesus. Luke will not even allow John the privilege of baptizing Jesus. Luke goes one step further than the Gospel of Matthew by placing John in prison before the baptism of Jesus. And that is why in the Gospel of Luke, this is how Luke narrates it in these two verses, chapter 3, verses 21 and 22, when the people had been baptized, and when Jesus had also been baptized and was praying. So Luke will show Jesus as praying at his baptism, but Luke will not tell us who baptized Jesus. He will only say that Jesus was baptized. All the three mention the three events which occur at the baptism of Jesus, which is the rending open of the heavens, though Luke will use a very soft verb when he says the heavens were opened, not rent open, but the heavens were open. A very gentle evangelist. The Holy Spirit comes down in bodily form. Only Luke has in bodily form. That means it could be seen coming on Jesus, and the voice issuing like in Mark, not in Matthew, but like in Mark, the voice issuing an invitation to Jesus to be slave and son, to be son who becomes son by being slave. Luke's baptism scene is followed by the genealogy of Jesus. And as we saw, Luke's genealogy begins with Jesus because Jesus begins the whole new second era of his history, and Luke will end with Adam to show that in this 12th generation now, Jesus is the new Adam. The temptation seen in the Gospel of Luke is similar, not the same, is similar to the Gospel of Matthew, but it seems that Luke has changed the order to have the third temptation, which is Jesus being taken to the pinnacle of the temple as the third, as the climax in his narrative. Also Luke in chapter 4, verse 13, which is the last verse here, wants to show us in these verses that the devil, Luke will say, left him until an opportune time. So in chapter 4, verse 13, this is what Luke will tell us, and the devil left him until an opportune time. What Luke is saying through this verse is that Jesus continued to be tempted, that these three temptations were not the beginning and the end of the temptation of Jesus. He continued to be tempted throughout his life to give up that mission to be king's servant. The ministry in Galilee is very, very similar to the ministry in the Gospel of Mark. However, the first scene is where Jesus comes into Nazareth, his hometown, and the first scene, namely Luke 4, 14 to 30, is exclusive to Luke. If in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 15, Jesus comes into Galilee and proclaims, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe in the gospel. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, verse 17, the words of Jesus are, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In Luke, this first proclamation, this inaugurated proclamation, is shown by Jesus reading in the synagogue the text from Isaiah on a Sabbath day. And it also shows Jesus changing the text from Isaiah to put in words which Jesus thinks are important, or which the Lucan Jesus thinks are important. So therefore, the wrath of God is forgotten as far as Jesus is concerned, and Jesus speaks about the favor of God. So in chapter 4, verses 14 to 30, in this inaugural proclamation, Jesus is very, very clear that he will be the one who will come to make home. In Isaiah, the coming of the Messiah is a time when the lame will walk and the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the dumb will speak, and the poor will have the good news preached to them. This scene in the synagogue is followed by his rejection. The rejection in the Gospel of Mark comes a little later in chapter 6, in Matthew even later in chapter 13, but in Luke, the rejection in his hometown is almost immediately after Jesus reads this text from Isaiah and explains it by quoting the widow of Zarephath and by quoting the healing of Naaman the Syrian to show that he has come not for the righteous, but he has come for sinners. This scene is followed by the calling of Simon in his boat after the miraculous catch, even as Jesus is teaching and inviting Simon to become a fisher of men and women to this new vocation. As soon as the disciples are called, they will begin the controversies. And the controversies with the Pharisees are largely about not keeping the Sabbath law, whether it is plucking grains of corn, whether it is healing on the Sabbath, whether it is not fasting on the Sabbath, and so on. Basically, those are the controversy with the Pharisees, which begin in the Gospel of Luke within the ministry in Galilee. The preaching of Jesus, where he tells or speaks the Sermon on the Plain, is found in chapter 6, immediately after this controversy. Luke's sermon is called the Sermon on the Plain. This is because in Luke chapter 6, verse 12, Jesus begins to choose his 12 disciples whom he will call apostles. These 12 Jesus brings down with him and doesn't remain on the mountain where he has chosen them, but brings them down, and he stands at a level place from which he proclaims the Sermon on the Plain, and that is why it is called the Sermon on the Plain. It is much shorter than the sermon in the Gospel of Matthew, which runs for 2 whole chapters, Matthew chapter 5 verse 1 to chapter 7 verse 28. In Luke, it is much shorter, less than a chapter of the Gospel of Luke. However, if Matthew has 8 plus 1 Beatitudes, Luke has, you might say, 3 plus 1 Beatitudes, but correspondingly 3 plus 1 woes. So Luke's Gospel contains not only the Beatitudes to the poor, not poor in spirit, but to the poor, those who weep and those who are hungry and those who are persecuted, but it contains woes to those who are rich and those who are laughing and those who are filled now and those of whom people speak well. That is how Luke's Sermon on the Plain begins, and moves on to say some of the things that were said by Jesus in the Matthean Sermon on the Mount. The response to Jesus' ministry is both positive and negative, and it is in the last part here, chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, where Luke will tell us of the women disciples of Jesus. The parable of the sower and the seed, the parable of the mustard seed, is all told within the context of chapter 8 of the Gospel of Luke, and then the mighty works like the calming of the storm, and then the question of who Jesus is. Jesus asking the disciples the impression which Herod has of Jesus, and the answer which Simon Peter gives are all found in chapter 9 of the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, Simon Peter's answer is, "You are the Christ of God." The answers are different in the different Gospels. If in Mark it is simply, "You are the Christ." If in Matthew, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In the Gospel of Luke, it is, "You are the Christ of God," or the Anointed One of God, or the Messiah of God. And then This section, the ministry in Galilee, ends with even more mighty works. Because the evangelists do not use the term miracles, I call them also mighty works. They use the term dunamis, which means basically mighty works. So they are not so much miraculous works as mighty works which Jesus does. This journey narrative, sometimes known as the travel narrative, is the longest part in the Gospel of Luke. It runs for a total of 10 chapters. And how does this narrative begin? In 951 of the Gospel of Luke, we are told very clearly that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. Even though the Lucan Jesus is a very mild Jesus, a Jesus who keeps reaching out to people. In this verse 951, which begins his journey narrative or travel narrative, very clearly, Luke shows Jesus as determined, as focused. Right away, 951, Luke says he set his face toward Jerusalem. That means nothing now will deter the Lord. The travel narrative might be seen to be divided into 8 parts. The rejected Lord now turns toward Jerusalem, where he will be rejected totally. It is here in this section that the parable of the Good Samaritan is told, and the first interpretation which I will give will be of the parable of the Good Samaritan and what it means for us today. Immediately following the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus speaks about love of neighbor and who neighbor is, it is followed by love of God as contrasted in the 2 figures of Martha and Mary, what I call focused contemplation and distracted action. There is also the challenge to prayer. It is in this context of chapter 11 that Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, and not only teaches them to pray, but teaches them also perseverance in prayer. The Beelzebul controversy is followed by the demand for a sign, which Jesus, of course, refuses to give, and the denunciation of those who ask for that sign. In chapter 12, Jesus speaks about the dangers of money and about not being able to serve 2 masters or 2 persons at the same time, God and mammon, about how possessions can possess us, and therefore about stewardship and about fidelity. Jesus must go to Jerusalem. And the reason why must has been put in capital letters is because it signifies what I would term as a theological passive. A theological passive means that it is God who has ordained it, and it is Jesus who will obey. So that's why Jesus must go to Jerusalem. It is the plan of God. It is God who sets this plan in motion. In chapters 15 and 16, there are a number of parables which are unique to the Gospel of Luke. The lost coin, where the woman loses a coin. This parable that I call the Prodigal Father. The shrewd steward, not the dishonest steward, as some might say. I prefer to call it the shrewd steward, and I will take this for our reflection. The rich man and Lazarus, where, as I said the last time, the only parable where a character in the parable is named Lazarus, which means God helps. So this is a very special section of the Gospel of Luke, and I will speak about the prodigal father and the shrewd steward in our interpretation in a few moments from now. forgiveness, faith, servanthood, the healing of the 10 lepers. This is another miracle that is found also only in the Gospel of Luke. Here too, the point is not only gratitude for something good which has happened, like this one leper who comes back, and gratitude is the point, but more than gratitude, the point is the one who comes to give thanks, and Jesus says it is a foreigner, that is the Samaritan. So once again, in keeping with chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, where Jesus focuses on the Samaritan, here too, Luke will focus on the Samaritan. Out of the 10, one was a Samaritan, the other 9 were Jews. The Jews did not return to give gratitude to God in Jesus, but the Samaritan, the foreigner, returned. So that is much more the point than Jesus expecting gratitude. It is in this context also that Jesus will tell a special parable of the persistent widow. Some call this parable the parable of the unjust judge. But the injustice of the judge is not so much the focus as is the persistence or perseverance of the widow. Even this on prayer, the Pharisee and the tax collector, which is once again a very beautiful lesson in how we must pray. Jesus tells us about the different methods of prayer. Children are always the ones who get entry into the kingdom of heaven, and it is within this context that the third passion and resurrection prediction is predicted by Jesus. And here a beautiful scene of Zacchaeus, which I hope to be able to take even as we move on. The ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem is for a total of 2 chapters, chapters 20 and 21. So Jesus enters into Jerusalem, and then he predicts the fate of Jerusalem and the protest. Notice the reason why I call it the protest rather than the cleansing is because unlike the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, where elaborate details are given, Luke narrates this protest in the temple in just 2 verses. He only drives out, the Lucan Jesus drives out those who are selling in the temple. Luke does not give us details about the doves and about the money changers and about overturning their tables. No details are given except that Jesus drove out those who were selling things, because the temple is not a place where sale must take place. It is a place where God must be worshipped, and that is why Jesus continues teaching in the temple even after he protests. He begins, or Luke begins, by telling us that there is a double response to Jesus, and especially this protest in the temple. So because this hostility is followed by the protest in the temple, there are some who object to Jesus protesting in the temple, but there are others who are so taken up with Jesus that they really hang on to every word coming from his lips. It is then that a similar scene which we saw in the Gospel of Mark, where there are a number of questions, first about his authority, and then the parable which Jesus tells about the wicked tenants, the question which he is asked about taxes to Caesar, the Sadducees who try to trap him by asking the question about the resurrection. Jesus and the Messiah is much, much greater than David's son. Jesus criticizes the scribes because they devour widows' houses, and he praises the widow's mite, and he speaks about the destruction of the temple through the eschatological discourse. The final part in the structure of the Gospel of Luke is the passion and the resurrection narratives. The passion narrative begins with the conspiracy to arrest Jesus by the chief priests and the scribes. Judas, of course, plays into their hands by agreeing to betray Jesus, and they agreed to give him a sum of money. Matthew is the only one who tells us about the 30 pieces of silver. Luke tells us they agreed to pay him, but does not tell us how much they pay him. The preparations for the Passover meal are made, and Jesus eats this Last Supper with his disciples, even as he predicts his betrayal. Notice the dispute about greatness, and this is tremendously challenging to accept. The dispute about greatness is even as Jesus is predicting that he is going to be betrayed and predicting that he is going to be denied. It shows the obtuseness of the disciples. It shows the blindness of those who were sitting at table with Jesus when, in the middle, we notice of the prediction of the betrayal and the prediction about denial, there is a dispute about who is the greatest. Jesus gives them new rules which they must follow because he is going to be tried, and prays that they be spared from the trial because he is not sure whether they will be able to withstand it. After the meal, he is arrested, and Peter denies Jesus. The scene that Peter has denied Jesus, Luke chapter 22, verses 61 and 62, are found only in the Gospel of Luke. All the evangelists tell us that Peter wept after denying Jesus. But it is only Luke who makes the connection between Peter's denying, between Jesus looking at Peter after Peter denied, and Peter weeping. In Luke, it is after Jesus looks at Peter that Luke says, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. What I would like you to do for your reflection this evening in your prayer, read these verses, 2 verses only, chapter 22, verses 61 and 62. Read them again and again and again. And then ask yourself, what kind of a look do you think Jesus would have given Peter? Luke, the evangelist, does not tell us what kind of a look it was. He only tells us, and he's the only one who tells us this, that after the third denial, Jesus turned and looked at Peter, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. So ask yourself, even as you read this text, what kind of a look do you think Jesus would have given Peter? And I will take this up on Monday. This is followed by the mocking of Jesus, by the Sanhedrin trial, where a lot of accusations are made, and then because those accusations don't seem to be sticking, they take Jesus to Pilate. Luke is the only one who mentions Jesus before Herod. No other evangelist speaks about Herod in the midst of the trial of Jesus except Luke. And one very likely reason why Luke has done this is to show that the death of Jesus, or even as he is being condemned to death, Jesus is bringing together the Gentile as represented by Pilate and the Jew as represented by Herod. Because Luke will tell us in chapter 23 verse 12 that after Herod sent him back to Pilate, Herod and Pilate became friends that day. Before that they were enemies. So Luke is saying it is Jesus and the trial of Jesus and the condemnation of Jesus which makes the Gentile Pilate and the Jew Herod become friends. Pilate declares Jesus innocent, but even as he declares him innocent, and this is the irony, Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified in order to satisfy the crowd. The way of the cross is where Simon of Cyrene is invited, and Jesus, hanging on the cross, is crucified and mocked. The two criminals, of which one is the good thief who is promised paradise, is in the Gospel of Luke, because Luke's is the Gospel of great forgiveness. Jesus dies on the cross, laying his life into the hands of the Father, commending his spirit into the Father's hands, and forgiving those before he can die, and making an excuse for them. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. So not only does Jesus ask the Father to forgive, he makes an excuse why they must be forgiven. Jesus dies on the cross, and the two events, namely the rending open of the veil of the temple, is mentioned by Luke, and the centurion pronouncing Jesus as innocent. Jesus is buried, and the women who are looking from afar see the place where he is buried. The resurrection narrative of the Gospel of Luke may be seen into 5 small parts, namely the empty tomb, which begins the resurrection narrative in all the 4 Gospels. This scene where Jesus meets the disciples on the road to Emmaus is found only in the Gospel of Luke, and is a very beautiful text. Jesus appears to the disciples in Jerusalem, because in Luke, Jerusalem, as we saw right from the beginning, the temple, as we saw right from the beginning, is the place where everything will happen. And that is why when the disciples are moving to Emmaus or moving away from Jerusalem, they are not doing the right thing. Jesus, or the risen Jesus, now instructs his disciples before he can be taken up into heaven. Luke's gospel is the only gospel which ends with the ascension scene. In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks about his ascending to the Father. In the Gospel of Matthew, the risen Jesus promises that he will be with them always. In the Gospel of Mark, there is only the empty tomb, but it is only in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus is shown as ascending into heaven, and the disciples are shown as it being in the temple, continuing their ministry in the temple, praising and glorifying God. Of the many texts which I could take to explain, I will take a few for our brief reflection on what Luke means through these texts, and how you can interpret few this way other texts that you find in the Gospel of Luke. When we look at this particular text, which is often known as the parable of the Good Samaritan, I have highlighted some things which I would like you to know. What is the background to this text of chapter 10, verses 29 to 37? Background is this: a scribe has come to Jesus and asked the question about the great commandment, or the greatest commandment. And Jesus tells him not about one commandment, but gives him 2, that is, love of God and love of neighbor. The man, of course, knows that that is the right answer. And then Luke begins by telling us this in verse 29, but wanting to justify himself, or even you might interpret this as wanting to test Jesus even further, he wants Jesus to clarify. And so he asks, and who is my neighbor? When we look at the last verses, which I have highlighted once again in yellow, we notice Jesus does not seem to be answering who is my neighbor. Rather, Jesus is asking again, notice, Which of these three do you think was a neighbor? Now, first of all, if we look at the question of the lawyer, and who is my neighbor, the answer might be the neighbor is the man who needs your help, the man who has been robbed by robbers, the man on the street who is lying half dead, the man who has no one to care for him. And man can also be woman, or the person who has no one to care for him, the person on the street, the person who is marginalized, the person who is relegated to the garbage dumps. That person is your neighbor. However, notice Jesus does not speak about who the neighbor is. Rather, he asks a counter question, and who was neighbor? You might say, Jesus makes the question of the lawyer stand on its head because the focus of Jesus is different. Another thing I would like you to notice, and that's why I put this here, notice, now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Luke dismisses the priest in just one verse. Then, likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. So the priest and the Levite are dismissed in one verse. Then notice, but a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. Now, most of those who were listening to Jesus would possibly have been Jews. And even as they would hear Jesus, they would say, if the priest passed by, if the Levite passed by, the Samaritan, if he comes near, the man will come to rob him, will come to take what little he has, will come to see what he can gain. That is what they would imagine. And they would expect the fourth person to come, a pious Jew, to come and help him. But notice, Jesus, the master storyteller, he says, the Samaritan while traveling came near. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. This is unexpected of a Samaritan. He went to him, bandaged his wounds. So you see the details. In other words, giving the details about bandaging the wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, putting him on his animal, bringing him to the inn, telling the innkeeper to take care of him, giving 2 denarii, which would be equal to at least 2 weeks of care, and telling him that he would repay whatever he spent, is all unexpected. The people would have been stunned. What we notice is this, that even though Jesus has used the word Samaritan, he has used this term Samaritan when he asked the question of this lawyer. The lawyer cannot answer Samaritan, but answers, notice, the one who showed him mercy. And that is why we need to understand in this now, what exactly is Jesus trying to say? So first, the man who is beaten up by robbers, the man who is naked and left half dead, is in desperate need. The man will die if he is left as he is. Jesus begins by speaking about the prime representative of religion who passes by and fails to come to the aid of the man. Some say that the reason why the priest would pass by was because the priest might not want to defile himself. And even if that is true, if the priest might not want to defile himself because he could not touch a corpse and it's likely the man was dead and not half dead, the priest could not know, so better safe than sorry. Even if that is the explanation which some give, which is why the priest did not go to his aid, the fact is that the priest regarded the law as more important than love. That the priest regarded keeping the Sabbath as more important than helping someone in need, and the Levite, who is in a way second after the priest, did the same. So the priest and the Levite, representatives of religion who should show the practice of religion in practice, were the ones who failed to come to the aid of the man. So very clearly, if these two who were so close to God, if these two from whom so much was expected could not help the man, it was very unlikely that the Samaritan would help him. And notice, among the people, it was said, he that eats the bread of the Samaritans is like one that eats the flesh of swine. In other words, you could not go lower than eating the flesh of swine. When the son in the parable of the prodigal father is sitting among the swine and wanting to eat the carob pods which the swine ate, and nobody would give anything, what Luke is telling us there, he reached the depths of degradation. Very clearly, he that eats the bread of the Samaritans is like one that eats the flesh of swine. What was the background of this? Israel was one nation under David and Solomon. In 921 BCE, Solomon died. And after Solomon died, his son Absalom could not hold Israel together. Because of his inability, Israel, the one nation, was divided into two. And this division into two was Israel in the north, with its capital at Samaria, and Judah in the south, with its capital at Jerusalem. So there is Israel and Samaria in the north, Judah and Jerusalem in the south. In 722 BCE, before the Common Era, in 722, the Assyrians came from the north and captured Israel and captured the capital Samaria. The Assyrian men, soldiers, guards, had relations with Israeli women. And the children born of that union between the Assyrians, who were considered Gentiles, and the Israeli women, the children born of that union were regarded as Samaritans. Now those who were in the south, who were actually brothers and sisters and relatives of those who were in the north, began now to look down on them. They considered them a mixed breed. They said that they were impure. That is how the people of Judah and Jerusalem looked down, and they called them Samaritans. Obviously, in 589 BCE, Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, and Judah also went into captivity, and it is there that they sang the song. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept, remembering Zion, remembering the days of King David. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So they also were captured later, but they remained as they were, and they kept looking down on the Samaritans. And this enmity was so powerful and so great that as time went by in history, this is how they would regard the Samaritan, that anyone who eats the bread of Samaritans is like one that eats the flesh of swine. So this is what Jesus is addressing even at his own time. And so the moment Jesus mentioned the word a Samaritan came by, the people would have been aware. Now what is going to happen? This man, this Samaritan, is going to punish this wounded man even more. He's going to steal whatever little he has. He's going to take the shirt from his back. That's how the Samaritan would be looked at. And then the detailed description of so many verses, Jesus usually was very circumspect in his use of words. But here, he uses so many words and mainly to describe the situation as realistically as possible. So those who were listening to him will literally be able to see the scene even as Jesus narrates it. They would see the man, they would see him pouring oil on his wounds, they would see him bandaging his wounds, they would see him taking it on his own ass, they would see him taking it to the innkeeper, they would see him looking after him, they would see him giving 2 denarii to the innkeeper. This amount would have provided the basic needs for 2 weeks. So the Samaritan is not merely helping the man there, he is helping the man even for the future, for the next 2 weeks. And not only that, he was possibly a man who kept on passing by that way often because he seemed to know the innkeeper, and he told the innkeeper that he would pay him back on his return. So he seems like to be a person who was moving up and down that particular way, maybe on business or whatever, we do not know. But the fact is, he goes beyond the call of duty. He goes much beyond the call of what would be expected of anyone. If he reached out to the man there and took the man to an hospital and left the man there like he left the man in the inn, and for 2 weeks, that is okay. The man should be able to look after himself after 2 weeks. But no, the Samaritan Jesus wants to show goes even beyond that, and that is why, at the end, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor? Notice, so the man who fell among robbers is not the neighbor. The neighbor is the one, the Samaritan. However, because the lawyer is a Jew, because the lawyer still has his prejudice, still has his stereotype, he cannot answer the word Samaritan, even though Jesus has clearly used the word Samaritan. The lawyer says, the one who showed mercy. In other words, he cannot escape the answer. He cannot but say the answer, but he tries to defend himself by not using the word Samaritan. So the point is this. Is it a parable in which Jesus wants to show that the priestly class and the Levites, who also belong to the priestly class, only talk but do not do? Does he want to show that the priestly class give more importance to the law than to love? Does Jesus want to take a dig at the priestly class and say that they are basically useless? Only as far as talking is concerned, they can do it, but they cannot do action? These might be true. Does Jesus want to show that helping the person fallen on the road, that helping the person in need is important, that we must reach out to our brothers and sisters who are fallen on the road, who need our help, who are marginalized, who are poor, who are beaten up? Yes, that is true, but only on the surface level. Then what seems to be the main point which Jesus is making in this parable, and according to me, the main point which is being made in this parable is this, that the Samaritan is good. That the one whom we consider negatively, that the one whom we have stereotypes about, that the ones whom we are prejudiced about, they are good. So the challenge is to remove our stereotypical way of looking. The challenge is to remove our narrow way of looking, our restricted way of looking. The challenge is to avoid labeling people from our limited experience. All too often, we label people because of the place where they come from, because of the religion that they might follow, because of their culture, Because of their background, we might label people, and when we label people, we label them with all the qualities which are negative. Oh, these people who come from that place, they are always like that. The people who speak this language are always like that. The people who worship this religion or belong to this religion are always like that. And these are stereotypes. We may have had an experience of one person who belonged to a particular religion who may have done something negative, and we generalize. In logic, there is a fallacy called overgeneralization. From a particular instance, you cannot move on to a general instance. And the famous syllogism which is given has to be understood. And the famous syllogism is this: all human beings are mortal. I am a human being, therefore I am mortal. Notice, we begin with the general, we begin with the universal. All human beings are mortal. Then I can say that because I am a human being, I am mortal. This is what is called to argue logically. But I cannot argue like this, saying, I am a human being, I am mortal, therefore all human beings are mortal. No, I am a human being, I have a weakness in my left hand, therefore every human being has a weakness in his left hand or her left hand. I cannot say that. So in other words, in the first instance, all human beings are mortal. I am a human being, I am mortal is perfectly logical. But I am a human being, I am lame in one leg, therefore all human beings are lame in one leg. I cannot say that. You see, in the second case, I am moving from a particular to universal. In the first case, I can move from universal to particular. So therefore, just because one person of a particular community, one person of a particular culture, one person who begins to worship a particular God, one person who begins to speak in a particular language has done something negative to me, and I have a negative view of that person, does not mean that everyone who worships in that way, everyone who speaks that language, everyone who dresses in that way is the same. I cannot say that. And it is better in such cases to give a positive rather than a negative interpretation. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, while it is telling us that the brothers and sisters fallen on the road, the poor, the marginalized, those who have got nothing to call their own, are our brothers and sisters, they're also telling us that we must avoid stereotyping, we must avoid prejudices, we must avoid looking with tainted glasses or in a restricted, in a narrow way. And so I ask myself, who are those whom I am prejudiced against? Is there an individual whom I keep looking at negatively? Is there an individual whom I keep looking at in a very narrow way? Or is there a group whom I keep labeling because I don't like that group? Whether it is a religious group, whether it is a language group, whether it is a cultural group, I need to be aware that it could be my own prejudice more than the reality which I see. In the case of this lawyer, it was his own prejudice which did not allow him to see that it was the Samaritan who showed mercy, but he cannot escape. And therefore, he does not say that it was the Samaritan who showed mercy, but he says that the one who showed mercy was you. So more than simply talking about reaching out in need, which Jesus is surely doing, Jesus is also telling us to avoid being prejudiced against groups or against individuals. Following this, because the earlier one was prejudices and love of neighbor, here Jesus speaks about our relationship with God. Now notice, we are in the journey narrative or the travel narrative. That's why Luke will constantly remind us of this when he tells us. Now notice in the first verse, now as they went on their way. So Jesus is moving. He's not going to be stopped. However, here, like even later in chapter 19, he enters a certain village. And a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Now notice, Mary assumes the position of a male. And Jesus allows her. And Jesus allows her. Why do I say the position of a male? Because very clearly at the time of Jesus, to sit at the master's feet was only done by males. Somebody asked me some days ago, what is the difference between a disciple and an apostle? This is a good scene in which you can see the distinction. Here the disciple is Mary, who sits at the Lord's feet and notice, listened to what he was saying. And see, Luke already gives us the key now how to interpret. Look at these keys. So I'm giving you these two texts so you can look at the keys which Luke is giving us, and that's why I've highlighted them in yellow. But Martha, notice, not Martha was doing many tasks, not Martha was serving, but notice, Luke will also give us the key. Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So in other words, if she is distracted, she is neither doing the tasks, nor is she looking at the Lord. Whom is she looking at? She is looking at a sister. How do I know? How do you know? Because she looks and says, Lord, do you not care if my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? This is what I term as the martyr complex. Not the Martha complex. Yes, it can be termed the Martha complex, but also the martyr complex. Oh, I'm the only one who is concerned. I'm the only one doing it. Nobody else is concerned about this work. Nobody else is concerned about this house. Nobody cares except I. I'm the only one going out for apostolate. I'm the only one doing this ministry. I'm the only one who is working for the Lord. Nobody else cares. So this is Martha and martyr. The Lord answered, Martha, Martha. The name calling twice is a gentle chiding. Because the Lord is very gentle, so he says, Martha, Martha. Notice, he points out the challenge. You are worried and distracted by many things. So notice, the Lord is not saying, as some mistakenly think, that contemplation is better than action. He's saying there is need of only one thing, because if there is this one thing, then everything else will follow. So by telling us that they were on their way, Luke is reminding us that we are in the journey narrative. What does Martha do? She takes up the position of a student with a rabbi. That is what Mary does. Martha is distracted. Her request is a logical one. Yes, she must marry her sister, must help her. But in the context, it is because of her lack of focus. Because she is looking neither at the Lord, nor is she focusing on what she was doing. Supposing Martha was focusing on what she was doing, whether it was cooking, whether it was arranging the table, whether it was washing, or whatever she was doing, which she thought was necessary to prepare for the Lord, she would not be able to look at the Lord, which did not matter, but nor would she be able to look at her sister. How is it that she can see neither the Lord nor the work that she's doing? Because she's focusing on the sister. So that means Martha's attention is not on the work she's doing. It's not on the tasks that she's accomplishing. Neither is Martha's attention on the Lord. You might say, Martha's attention is nowhere if it is on her sister. So the point which Jesus makes is that it is her worry and her distraction which does not allow her. So the contrast is with the preoccupation with the practical affairs of life and engagement with the kingdom. When I talked about the mission discourse of Matthew, I reminded you that the mission is the mission of the Lord's and not my mission. It is only when I mistakenly think that it is my mission that I will get agitated, that I will feel upset, that I will get nervous, that I think I'm a failure. But if I keep remembering that the mission is the mission of the Lord's, like Martha, if she kept remembering that I'm doing this to serve, it would have been enough. But because neither does she look at the Lord, nor does she look at the work she's doing, but at her sister, is her reason for being upset. So the contrast in these verses is not between contemplation and action, is not being a contemplative in action, but doing what you are doing. So when you are contemplating, focus your contemplation. When you are acting, act your action. Here, however, Mary is focused contemplation, and that's why Mary can listen to what the Lord has to say. Martha's is distracted action, and that is why she presumes to tell the Lord what the Lord must say. You notice, this is how many of us are. So what the Lord is asking us to do is asking us to focus our contemplation and to focus our action also. The Lord is not saying only contemplate, only act. No, the Lord is saying focus your contemplation and focus also your action. The time is now close to